Every moment captures crucial evidence. Every inquiry demands total transparency. Mastering your legal rights, achieving lasting justice.
Hands higher! Get on the ground now!
Sir, I'm standing in my own home. Please listen. I'm a retired admiral. You can see the ID on the table.
Stop talking. Turn around and get on your knees.
Those are my medals on the wall. That's 29 years of service.
People fake this stuff all the time. Papers get forged.
Please look at the picture. That's
This
him
is
with
a
the secretary.
mistake.
He's telling the truth.
Yeah, right. Nice try.
At 5:47 a.m. on a quiet residential street in Virginia, ICE Special Agent Derek Lawson led a 6-man tactical team through the front door of a home without a warrant, weapons drawn, shouting commands at a 62-year-old man still in his pajamas. Lawson, a 12-year veteran of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, with a history of aggressive raids in minority neighborhoods, had been given a tip that an undocumented immigrant was living at this address. He ordered the man to the ground, dismissed his protests, and placed him in flex cuffs while his wife screamed from the hallway. What Lawson didn't know was that the man on the floor was Rear Admiral James Holloway, a 40-year decorated Navy veteran who had commanded nuclear submarines and advised 3 presidents, and this mistake would cost the agency $34.8 million and end multiple careers. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Rear Admiral James Holloway had woken up that Tuesday morning the same way he had for the past 3 years since retirement. At 62 years old, he still kept military discipline, rising at 5:30 a.m. to brew coffee before his morning walk. His home in Arlington, Virginia, was modest but proud, with framed commendations lining the hallway and a shadow box displaying his medals near the front door. Holloway had spent 40 years in the United States Navy, starting as an enlisted sailor and rising to command nuclear submarines before serving as a strategic advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He had navigated some of the most dangerous waters on Earth, managed crews of hundreds, and held security clearances that gave him access to the nation's most guarded secrets. Now, he spent his mornings walking his dog and his afternoons volunteering at the local VA hospital, helping younger veterans transition to civilian life. His wife, Diane, a retired school teacher, was still asleep when he heard the first bang on the door. The banging came again, harder this time, and Holloway moved toward the front door, in his pajamas and slippers, confused but not yet alarmed. Through the peephole, he saw men in tactical vests, and before he could process what was happening, the door burst open. ICE Special Agent Derek Lawson stormed in first, his sidearm drawn, barking orders in a voice trained to intimidate. Lawson was 38 years old, a former police officer from a suburb outside Dallas, who had joined ICE in 2012 during the height of immigration enforcement expansion. He had built a reputation inside the agency as aggressive and results-driven, someone who didn't hesitate to kick down doors and ask questions later. His file showed 14 formal complaints from residents alleging excessive force, racial profiling, and violations of civil rights, but none had resulted in disciplinary action. Lawson had been briefed that morning on a tip claiming an undocumented Jamaican national named James Hollins was living at this address, wanted for deportation after overstaying a visa. The intelligence was thin, based on a single unverified report and a partial name match in a database. But Lawson didn't care about the details. He saw a black man in his 60s and assumed he had the right target. Holloway raised his hands instinctively as Lawson shouted at him to get on the ground. He tried to speak, tried to explain who he was, but Lawson wasn't listening. 2 other agents rushed past them into the house, their boots echoing through the halls as Diane's panicked voice called out from the bedroom. Holloway dropped to his knees, his heart pounding, and said clearly that he was a retired Navy admiral and that they had the wrong house. Lawson glanced at him with something between suspicion and contempt, then told him to shut up and put his hands behind his back. The flex cuffs bit into Holloway's wrists as Lawson yanked them tight. And for the first time in his life, the Admiral felt what it was like to be treated as less than human in his own home. Diane appeared in the hallway in her robe, demanding to know what was happening, and one of the agents told her to stay back and be quiet. She was crying now, holding her phone, threatening to call their lawyer and anyone else who would listen. Holloway told her it was going to be okay, but he wasn't sure he believed it. Lawson searched the house while two agents kept Holloway on his knees in the living room. They rifled through drawers, opened closets, and knocked over a stack of books near the fireplace. Holloway kept repeating his name, his rank, and his service number, but Lawson dismissed it every time. He told Holloway that people lie all the time, that fake IDs and stolen identities were common, and that he'd heard every excuse in the book. When Diane brought out Holloway's military ID card, his VA card, and a framed photograph of him in dress uniform shaking hands with a former Secretary of Defense, Lawson barely looked at them. He said documents could be forged, and that they'd verify everything downtown. The other agents exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable, but none of them spoke up. One of them found Holloway's shadow box with his medals and paused for a moment, studying the Navy Cross and the Defense Distinguished Service Medal inside, but still said nothing. By 6:30 a.m., Holloway was in the back of an unmarked ICE vehicle, still in his pajamas, hands cuffed behind him, being driven to a detention facility in Fairfax. Diane stood in the doorway of their home, holding her phone, sobbing and furious, already calling their attorney and trying to reach someone, anyone, who could stop this. Lawson sat in the front seat of the vehicle, filling out paperwork on a tablet, satisfied that he'd completed another successful operation. He had no idea that the man in the back seat had commanded nuclear-armed submarines, had briefed presidents, and had spent 4 decades defending the very country Lawson claimed to be protecting. And he had no idea that this raid, conducted without a warrant and based on nothing more than a name that sounded similar and a face that fit his assumptions, would become the most expensive mistake of his career, and a case study in civil rights violations that would be taught in law schools for years to come. The Fairfax Detention Facility was a cold, fluorescent-lit building that smelled like disinfectant and fear. Rear Admiral James Holloway was processed like every other detainee that morning, stripped of his wedding ring, his watch, and what little dignity Lawson had left him. The intake officer, a young woman named Martinez, who looked barely out of college, asked for his name and country of origin while typing into an outdated computer system. Holloway told her he was a United States citizen, a retired Navy admiral, and that he had been taken from his home without a warrant or probable cause. Martinez looked up from her screen with something close to sympathy, but she had heard desperate claims before, and her job was to process people, not judge the circumstances that brought them here. She told him someone would verify his information and that he needed to cooperate. Holloway asked to call his attorney and was told he could make a phone call after processing was complete. Holloway was placed in a holding cell with 11 other men, most of them Spanish-speaking, all of them confused and afraid. He sat on a metal bench bolted to the wall and tried to steady his breathing, a technique he had learned decades ago during survival training when he was a young officer. The cell had no windows, just cinder block walls painted institutional gray, and a single toilet in the corner with no privacy. The other men glanced at him occasionally. This older black man in pajamas, who kept his back straight and his hands folded in his lap, like he was sitting in a briefing room instead of a detention cell. One of them, a Salvadoran man named Luis, who spoke broken English, asked Holloway what he had done to end up here. Holloway said he hadn't done anything except be black and answer his front door. Luis nodded slowly, understanding in a way that needed no translation. Hours passed with no word from anyone. Holloway had been told he could make a phone call, But every time he asked a guard when that would happen, he was told to sit down and wait. Outside the cell, he could hear agents laughing in a break room, the hiss of a coffee machine, the crackle of radios, all the normal sounds of a workday for people who weren't locked in a cage. At one point, a supervisor named Captain Dennis Kroger walked past the holding area with a clipboard, doing a routine inspection. Kroger was a 20-year ICE veteran, the kind of bureaucrat who had learned to ignore inconvenient details and follow the path of least resistance. One of the other detainees called out to him in Spanish, begging for information about when they would see a judge, and Kroger ignored him completely. Holloway stood and approached the bars, asking Kroger, in a calm, commanding voice, if anyone had verified his identity yet. Kroger stopped, looked at Holloway with the tired annoyance of someone who had heard 1,000 complaints, and told him that everyone claimed to be someone important, and that the system would sort it out. Holloway said his name again, his rank, and the fact that his information could be verified with a single phone call to the Department of Defense. Kroger wrote something on his clipboard and walked away. While her husband sat in a cell, Diane Holloway was waging war from their living room. She had called their attorney, Marcus Chen, within minutes of the raid, and Chen had immediately begun making calls to everyone he could think of. Chen was a civil rights lawyer with 15 years of experience handling police misconduct cases, and even he was stunned by what Diane was describing. He told her to document everything, take photographs of the damaged door, the ransacked rooms, anything the agents had touched or broken. Diane walked through the house with her phone, filming the overturned furniture, the drawers left open, the boot prints on their cream-colored carpet. She found her husband's military records scattered across his office floor, documents marked with security classifications that ICE agents had no business touching. Chen told her he was filing an emergency petition for release, and that he would have James out by the end of the day, but his voice carried a doubt he tried to hide. The system didn't move quickly, especially not for someone ICE had already decided was guilty. Diane also called their son Lieutenant Commander David Holloway, who was stationed at Naval Base San Diego. David was 34 years old, an officer following in his father's footsteps, and when his mother told him what had happened, he went silent for a full 10 seconds before erupting. He told her he was getting on the next flight to Virginia, and that he was calling everyone he knew at the Pentagon. Within 2 hours, David had reached out to a rear admiral he had served under, who made calls to the Judge Advocate General's office, who made calls to the Department of Homeland Security. The message was clear. You have a decorated flag officer in detention without cause, and this needs to be fixed immediately. But the bureaucracy moved like molasses, each layer of oversight pointing to the next, each official saying they needed to verify the information before taking action. Back at the detention facility, Agent Derek Lawson was sitting in his office filing his report when Captain Kroger knocked on the door. Kroger told him there was a problem with the Holloway case, that the detainee was claiming to be a retired admiral and that there were calls coming in from the Pentagon asking questions. Lawson leaned back in his chair, irritated but not concerned, and said that people lie, that stolen valor was a real thing, and that they needed to verify everything before releasing anyone. Kroger agreed, saying they couldn't just let someone go because they made a phone call, and that they would run Holloway's fingerprints through the federal database and see what came back. Lawson nodded, satisfied, and went back to his paperwork. Neither man considered the possibility that they had made a catastrophic mistake, and neither man seemed bothered by the fact that a 62-year-old man was sitting in a cell without access to a lawyer or a phone call, nearly 6 hours after being taken from his home. At 2:15 p.m., the fingerprint results came back. The system flagged Holloway's prints as a match to a file in the Department of Defense personnel database. with a security clearance level that required additional verification. The report clearly listed his name, rank, service dates, and the fact that he had retired honorably in 2022. The intake officer, Martinez, printed the report and brought it to Kroger's office, her hands shaking slightly. Kroger read it twice, his face going pale, then walked directly to Lawson's office and closed the door behind him. The conversation lasted 3 minutes, and when Kroger emerged, he looked like a man who had just realized his career was over. Lawson followed him out, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the hallway like he was looking for an exit that didn't exist. Even with the verification in hand, Holloway was not released immediately. Kroger and Lawson spent another hour in a conference room with ICE's regional legal counsel, trying to figure out how to minimize the damage. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Stephanie Ortiz, who had seen this kind of disaster before, told them in no uncertain terms that they had violated multiple constitutional rights and that the agency was now facing a massive liability. She told them to release Holloway immediately, to apologize, and to prepare for a lawsuit. Lawson argued that they had been acting on credible intelligence and that mistakes happen in law enforcement. Ortiz cut him off and told him that credible intelligence required more than a partial name match and that barging into someone's home without a warrant was illegal regardless of the outcome. Kroger sat silently, knowing that his signature was on the approval for the raid and that his name would be all over the lawsuit. At 4:47 p.m., nearly 11 hours after being taken from his home, Rear Admiral James Holloway was released from detention. He was given back his wedding ring, his watch, and a plastic bag containing his house keys. No one apologized. No one explained what had happened or why it had taken so long to verify what he had been saying since the moment Lawson kicked in his door. Holloway walked out of the facility in his pajamas, his wrists still red from the flex cuffs, and found Diane and Marcus Chen waiting for him in the parking lot. Diane ran to him, sobbing, and Holloway held her for a long time without saying anything. Chen approached them carefully, his face a mixture of relief and fury, and told Holloway that they needed to talk. Holloway looked back at the detention facility, at the building where he had spent the day being treated like a criminal, in the country he had served for 40 years, and said quietly that he was ready to make sure this never happened to anyone else. Marcus Chen didn't waste time. Within 48 hours of James Holloway's release, he filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against ICE, Agent Derek Lawson, Captain Dennis Kroger, and the Department of Homeland Security. The complaint alleged unlawful entry, false imprisonment, racial profiling, and violation of Fourth Amendment rights. Chen also filed a Freedom of Information Act request demanding all documents related to the raid, including the intelligence report that had justified it. What came back 3 months later was worse than anyone expected. The so-called credible intelligence that Lawson had used to obtain approval for the raid was a single anonymous tip called into an ICE hotline, claiming that a Jamaican man named James Hollins was living at an address in Arlington. The tipster provided no photograph, no documentation, and no verification of identity. An ICE database analyst had run the name through the system and found a deportation order for James Hollins, a 41-year-old Jamaican national who had overstayed a visa in 2019. The analyst noted that the address on file for Hollins was in Florida, not Virginia, and that the physical description didn't match. Despite these red flags, the tip was forwarded to Lawson's unit as actionable intelligence. Chen's legal team also uncovered internal emails that revealed the depth of negligence. One email from Lawson to his supervisor requested approval for a dawn raid at Holloway's address, describing the target as a dangerous immigration fugitive with possible gang affiliations. There was no evidence to support any of this. Another email from Captain Kroger approved the operation with a single line that said proceed with standard protocols. The standard protocols apparently didn't include verifying the target's identity before breaking down his door. During depositions, Lawson admitted under oath that he had not checked property records, had not surveilled the address, and had not attempted any form of verification beyond the database match. When asked why he ignored Holloway's military ID and medals during the raid, Lawson said he assumed they were stolen or fake. When asked why he didn't release Holloway immediately after the fingerprint verification came back, Lawson said he wanted to be thorough. The jury would later watch the deposition video in silence, and several members would shake their heads in disbelief. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and the courtroom was packed every single day. Rear Admiral James Holloway sat at the plaintiff's table in his dress uniform. Every medal he had earned over 40 years pinned to his chest. A silent reminder of what ICE had trampled that morning. Marcus Chen presented the case methodically, walking the jury through every failure, every ignored red flag, and every moment of cruelty that followed. He showed them the anonymous tip that started it all, the emails that proved no one had bothered to verify anything, and the video of Lawson's deposition where he admitted he assumed a decorated war hero was a criminal because of the color of his skin. Diane Holloway testified about watching her husband dragged out of their home in handcuffs. David Holloway testified about the frantic calls he made to the Pentagon while his father sat in a cell. James Holloway himself took the stand and described in quiet, measured tones what it felt like to spend 40 years defending his country, only to be treated like an enemy in his own home. The defense argued that mistakes happen in law enforcement and that the agents had been acting in good faith. The jury didn't buy it. After 4 hours of deliberation, they returned a verdict of $34.8 million in damages. The courtroom erupted. Holloway closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, and Diane gripped his hands so tightly, her knuckles turned white. The jury awarded $10 million in compensatory damages and $24.8 million in punitive damages, sending a clear message that this kind of negligence and racial profiling would not be tolerated. Agent Derek Lawson was terminated from ICE 6 days after the verdict. Captain Dennis Kroger was demoted and reassigned to a desk job in Montana before quietly retiring 3 months later. The Department of Homeland Security issued a statement saying they took civil rights seriously and were reviewing their procedures, though no systemic changes were ever implemented. James Holloway used a portion of the settlement to establish a legal defense fund for veterans and minorities wrongly targeted by law enforcement. He gave interviews to national media, not for attention, but to make sure people understood that if this could happen to a retired admiral, it could happen to anyone. When asked what he wanted people to take away from his story, Holloway said he wanted them to remember that rank and medals shouldn't be necessary to be treated with dignity, but that every person deserved the basic respect he'd been denied. The shadow box with his medals went back up on the wall, but the crack in the frame from where ICE agents had knocked it over was never repaired. Holloway said he kept it that way as a reminder.
Seeking truth is a collective journey, and factual knowledge is your armor. Thank you for viewing and supporting Global Accountability.